Tonight, we step into a secret the Church worked for centuries to keep in the shadows. A story not of demons or devils, but of gods far older, whose power refused to fade. From the banks of the Nile to the heart of Rome, the gods of Egypt held sway over sailors, mothers, merchants, and kings. Isis, the mother, Serapis, the savior, Hermes, the revealer of hidden wisdom. They promised protection, healing, and eternal life, a system of devotion so effective it threatened to eclipse the rising faith of Christianity. The Vatican could name Satan, could point to him as the enemy of all souls, but the Egyptian gods were different. They were too beloved to be dismissed, too adaptable to be condemned, too close to Christian ritual to be safely ignored. Incense, processions, sacred meals, even the halo itself carried their fingerprints. To erase Egypt would have meant erasing half of what made worship work. So the Church chose another strategy. It absorbed, rebranded, reshaped, and silenced. Temples became chapels, Isis became Mary, and obelisks crowned with crosses stood in the very heart of Rome. Yet, beneath every ritual, every festival, every stone of the Vatican, the shadow of Egypt still lingers. This is not the story of devils. This is the story of a fear older than Satan himself. A fear that the gods of Egypt had built a sacred system that could never be destroyed, only managed. Like the video, subscribe. Because tonight, we uncover why the Vatican feared Egyptian gods more than Satan. Imagine standing in the shadow of the Colosseum. The crowds roar, the air smells of dust and sweat, and the early Christian preachers cry out against Satan, the devil, the enemy of souls. Their words echo across Rome like thunder, promising salvation from the clutches of the great deceiver. But beneath this theatre, beneath the drama of devils and demons, another struggle was unfolding, quieter, older, and far more dangerous. The true rival was not Satan, it was the gods of Egypt. Think of Isis, her image carried through city streets, veiled and crowned, holding her infant child. Roman sailors prayed to her for safe passage. Mothers knelt to her as protector. Philosophers spoke of her as the living wisdom of the universe. To many, she was not a demon, not an enemy, but a saviour who could answer prayers as swiftly as any Christian saint. And this was the problem. Satan was easy to fight. He was the villain, the shadow, the monster. But Isis was beloved. She was worshipped by emperors and peasants alike. She was impossible to turn into a cartoon villain. That made her more terrifying to the Church than the devil himself. Osiris, too, refused to die. His story was resurrection before the gospel. His death and return promised eternal life to his followers, and when Christians spoke of Christ rising from the grave, the echoes of Osiris already filled the Mediterranean world. The bishops knew this. They knew that people would see the similarity, that whispers of Egypt's mysteries would stain their sermons. So, they turned their fury against these gods, not because they were false alone, but because they were too familiar, too close, too powerful. By the 4th century, emperors issued edicts against pagan worship, but Egyptian cults survived in secret, in households, in hidden shrines, in whispered prayers at night. Even as the Church thundered against demons, bishops wrote long, careful arguments against Isis, Serapis, and Osiris. If these gods were gone, why spend so much ink? Why waste so much energy? The answer was simple. They were not gone. They refused to leave. Imagine Rome at sunset. The obelisks tower over the skyline, monuments dragged from the Nile and planted in the heart of empire. They were supposed to prove Rome's conquest, but instead they served as silent witnesses that Egypt was never truly defeated. Every shadow they cast reminded the Church that another story still lingered beneath the cross. The fear was not that people would worship Satan. The fear was that they would look at Isis and Mary, at Osiris and Christ, and wonder if the difference was smaller than the bishops wanted to admit. So the war began, a war not of swords, but of memory. Festivals were banned, Temples were stripped, statues were smashed or quietly recarved into saints. Yet still the gods endured, in jewelry, in mosaics, in lullabies sung by mothers who remembered, and that endurance haunted the Vatican for centuries. Because you can cast out demons with a prayer, but how do you erase a goddess who already looks like the Virgin, a god who already offers resurrection, a wisdom that already feels like truth? That was the question Rome feared, and maybe, just maybe, it still is. Picture Alexandria in the 2nd century. The sun sets over marble streets, the sea wind carries the smell of spices, and music drifts from a temple where torches burn against the twilight. Inside, priests and priestesses chant to Isis, her statue draped in gold and linen, her image both queen and mother. Merchants stop their work to join the crowd. Soldiers bow their heads. Women clutch their children close as incense rises into the air. This is not a fading cult. It is a living heartbeat, stronger than the sermons of bishops who try to call it idolatry. In Rome, the story is the same. The Isium Campens, a massive sanctuary dedicated to Isis and Serapis, stands only a short walk from the heart of empire. Its columns are decorated with hieroglyphs. Its walls echo with prayers for healing, protection, and guidance. Here you can find aristocrats dressed in silks alongside slaves with nothing but rags. All are equal in devotion. All are united by a god and goddess who promise comfort, miracles, and a place in eternity. For the early church, this was a nightmare. Not only because the Egyptian gods were foreign, but because they offered something dangerously similar to Christianity. Osiris was the god who died and rose again, his body torn apart and restored through the love of Isis. His myth told followers that death was not the end, that life continued beyond the grave. The Christian story of Jesus carried the same promise, but by then Osiris had been preaching it for over 1,000 years. And Serapis, a hybrid deity created to unite Greek and Egyptian faiths, offered philosophy wrapped in mystery, healing rituals that felt like both medicine and magic. In a world of disease and uncertainty, that was more appealing to a Roman citizen than a priest's warning about Satan. The temples would not stay buried. Even when emperors tried to shut them down, they reopened in secret. Families carried statues of Isis into their homes, hiding them behind curtains, lighting lamps in her honor when the streets fell silent. Travelers brought her worship across the sea. In Gaul, in Spain, even as far as Britain, shrines to Isis appeared like stubborn flowers pushing through stone. Christian leaders thundered against demons, yet they knew the real competition was not invisible devils, but temples filled with laughter, song, and hope. Imagine a mother in the year 300. Her child is sick, fever burning hot, no doctor nearby. She brings him to the temple of Isis, where priests wash the child in cool water from the Nile, sing hymns, and place amulets of protection around his neck. To her, this is salvation. No sermon about eternal damnation can match the comfort of a goddess who listens now. This was the threat, not abstract evil, but immediate love. And so the battle continued. Temples destroyed, rebuilt, destroyed again. Yet every time a stone fell, another hand raised it back up. The gods of Egypt were not fading ghosts. They were living rivals, and the Vatican's greatest fear was that no matter how much earth was piled on top of their memory, the temples would always rise again. She was everywhere, on coins, on statues, in frescoes glowing with colour. Isis stood not as a distant goddess, locked in myth, but as a presence that people could feel. To sailors, she was the star that guided them safely through storms, her image carved into the bows of ships, prayers whispered to her before the sails caught wind. To grieving wives, she was the eternal mourner, the woman who wept and fought to bring Osiris back from death. To mothers, she was the protector of children, holding her son Horus in her arms, eyes calm, full of love. She was a goddess who answered the most human needs, and that was exactly what made her more dangerous to the church than any demon. When Christianity rose in the Roman world, it needed its own mother figure. Mary, the mother of Jesus, slowly gained honor in the growing faith. She was holy, pure, and eventually called the Mother of God. But at first, her story was quiet, her role in Scripture small. Isis, by contrast, had centuries of worship behind her, a cult that stretched from Egypt across the Mediterranean, and an iconography that was already burned into the hearts of ordinary people. In mosaics, she sat on a throne nursing her child. In statues, she lifted a hand to bless sailors. In festivals, her priests led processions, where golden boats carried her likeness through crowded streets. She was not an abstract idea. She was alive in the daily rhythm of the empire. This was the challenge for bishops and theologians. How could Mary compete with Isis when Isis already embodied everything a community longed for? When plague struck, Isis was invoked as a healer. When storms threatened, Isis was the protector. When grief crushed families, Isis was the one who understood sorrow. The church spoke of eternal salvation, but Isis spoke of today, of now, of miracles that felt immediate. So slowly, Christianity began to reshape Mary. Her image began to borrow the visual language of Isis. Paintings showed her holding the Christ child in a posture nearly identical to Isis and Horus. Songs gave her titles that sounded like echoes of older hymns. Even the rituals of protection, the prayers for safe passage across seas, shifted into Marian devotion. What had been Isis's strength became Mary's, a quiet but deliberate replacement. Yet behind this adaptation was fear, because if Mary had to take Isis's place, it meant Isis's presence was still too strong to ignore. Imagine being a villager in the 4th century. You walk into a small church and see a new mosaic of Mary with the infant Jesus. But your grandmother tells you it looks exactly like the statue of Isis she once saw in Alexandria. The image feels familiar, almost comforting. That was the point. To erase Isis without ever truly erasing her, to bury her under a new name while keeping the devotion alive but redirected. Isis was never just a goddess. She was a model of divine tenderness, a cosmic mother who cared for every life, no matter how small. The church could condemn her as a demon, but that was never convincing. How could a demon bring healing, guide ships, protect children? And so Mary rose, crowned with the echoes of Isis, becoming the figure Rome needed, because Isis had already shown the world what a mother could be. The Vatican's fear was simple. People loved her too much. They always had, and maybe they always would. He was not born from myth alone. Serapis was designed. In the 3rd century before Christ, the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt faced a problem. They ruled over Egyptians who clung to Osiris and Apis, gods of the Nile and the afterlife, while their Greek settlers longed for Zeus and the familiar Olympian order. Instead of forcing one side to surrender, the rulers crafted a new god, one who blended Egyptian devotion with Greek philosophy. Serapis was his name, a figure tall and bearded like Zeus, crowned with a grain basket, symbolizing fertility and abundance, but carrying within him the death and resurrection story of Osiris and the sacred bull Apis. He was a god built for empire, and that made him almost unstoppable. His temple in Alexandria, the Serapeum, became one of the most famous sanctuaries of the ancient world. Pilgrims travelled from across the Mediterranean to seek healing, wisdom, and visions. The temple held vast libraries, sacred chambers, and ritual spaces filled with music and light. Statues of Serapis showed him seated like a philosopher king, radiating authority and mercy. Unlike many gods who seemed bound to a single city or people, Serapis spoke to everyone. He was Egyptian enough for the native population, Greek enough for settlers, and broad enough for anyone who sought comfort. This universal appeal was the danger. When Christianity began to spread, Serapis was already doing what the church hoped to achieve. He offered a path that was both spiritual and intellectual, rooted in mystery, but also rational. His priests healed the sick with rituals that looked like medicine, while philosophers in his temples debated the nature of the soul. His followers claimed dreams from Serapis brought wisdom and even cures. For ordinary people, the god was not distant but present, answering in sleep, in healing, in signs that felt impossible to ignore. For bishops, this was far more threatening than Satan. Satan was a symbol of evil, but Serapis was a god of order, life, and resurrection. To call him a demon would sound absurd to those who had been healed in his sanctuary or had seen his festivals light the streets with joy. The Christian message of salvation risked being overshadowed by a god who already promised much of the same. The Church's response was fierce. When Theodosius ordered the destruction of pagan temples in the late 4th century, the Serapeum was a prime target. Soldiers and monks stormed it, smashing statues, tearing down altars, scattering libraries. Yet the violence told its own story. You do not burn what is already forgotten. The Serapeum fell, not because it was weak, but because it was strong, too strong for the bishops to ignore. Imagine being a citizen of Alexandria, watching the smoke rise from the temple. For generations your family prayed to Serapis, found healing in his rituals, celebrated his festivals. And now, in one night, the image of your god is broken. But memory does not vanish so easily. Serapis had been built for empire, for a world of many peoples and many tongues. The Church tried to silence him, but the idea of a universal God who unites wisdom and resurrection never truly disappeared. That was the fear, that somewhere beneath the ashes, Serapis still whispered to the empire he once ruled. Imagine sitting in a candle-lit room in Alexandria, sometime in the 2nd century. The streets outside hum, with the noise of merchants and sailors, but inside, a small circle of students gather around a teacher who unrolls a fragile scroll. The words claim to be from Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great, a figure who was said to be part Egyptian Thoth, part Greek Hermes, and entirely divine messenger. The text speaks not of sin and forgiveness, but of mind and cosmos, of a knowledge that awakens the soul. It tells you that God is not locked in temples or priests, but woven into the very structure of the universe, waiting to be recognized within yourself. For someone weary of ritual and hierarchy, it is like stepping into sunlight. The Hermetic texts taught that salvation was not about obedience to bishops or participation in sacraments. Instead, it was about gnosis, personal insight into the mysteries of creation. If you could understand the harmony of stars, the movement of nature, and the spark of the divine within your mind, then you could ascend to higher realms. These writings made no demand for church attendance or tithes. They offered direct contact with the divine, a path of inner discovery that made every believer into their own priest. In a world where the Christian church was slowly building authority, this was a dangerous alternative. The apostles preached that Jesus was the only way to salvation, that grace flowed through baptism, communion, and the authority of the church. The Hermetic tradition whispered something else entirely. It suggested that enlightenment was possible without mediation, that wisdom was written into the stars and etched into the soul. To the bishops, this was not merely competition, it was rebellion. If people could find God on their own, the structure of priesthood and ritual collapsed. What made Hermeticism even more threatening was its elegance. The texts blended philosophy with poetry. They described the universe as a living being, every part connected, every soul a reflection of the divine. Readers felt not condemned but exalted. They were not sinners crawling before God, but luminous beings awakening to their true nature. The Hermetica did not demand fear of Satan. It offered awe of creation. It did not center on sacrifice. It centered on knowledge, a kind of knowledge that anyone could pursue. Imagine being a young scholar in Alexandria, trained in Greek logic but curious about Egyptian mystery. You open the Corpus Hermeticum and read lines that say, God is mind, that the world is God's body, that to know yourself is to know the cosmos. It is intoxicating, almost impossible to resist. It makes the sermons about devils and punishment seem heavy and clumsy by comparison. The Church responded by labeling these texts as dangerous, eventually banning them, though copies survived in secret. Monks preserved them in libraries, scholars whispered their wisdom in private, and later the Renaissance would resurrect them to inspire magicians, scientists, and philosophers. But in the early centuries, their power lay in the threat they posed, not a threat of demons, but of independence. Hermes Trismegistus promised that the divine was not owned by priests or guarded by altars. It was inside you already, and that, for the apostles and their successors, was the most terrifying message of all. In the heart of Rome, long before dawn, the streets would begin to hum with life. Vendors set up stalls selling bread, fish, and bright cloths. Musicians tuned lyres and drums, and the scent of incense mixed with the aroma of fresh bread. But this ordinary morning could suddenly become extraordinary. Along the cobbled streets, a procession appeared, a boat mounted on wheels, adorned with golden images of Isis, her eyes painted to gleam in the sunlight. Priests chanted hymns and waved censers, while acolytes scattered petals in rhythm with the music. Romans from every walk of life paused to watch, some kneeling, some reaching for the petals, believing that touching them might heal their children, cure their fevers, or bring them luck. Miracles were not just whispered tales, but public spectacle. At shrines along the Tiber and in bustling market squares, oracles spoke in riddles that seemed to predict everything from the rising of the Nile to the success of a merchant's shipment. People claimed to witness the sick walking again, crippled limbs moving as if newly formed, and the blind seeing the world in colours they had never imagined. It was joyful, immersive, and alive, a kind of magic that pulled the soul as much as the eyes. Christians could preach about sin and Satan, but how do you compete with laughter, music, and the smell of incense promising tangible blessings? The festivals themselves were marvels of organisation. Boats carrying statues of gods floated down the Tiber, accompanied by singers, dancers, and priests in elaborate robes. Citizens waved from the banks, throwing coins into the water as offerings, hoping for divine favour. Every age group was involved, from children to elderly senators. The sense of civic joy, of community bonded by spectacle and wonder, created a magnetic pull that simple sermons could not match. What made these events especially difficult for Christian authorities was that miracles did not require belief in doctrine. A Roman could touch a sacred relic, witness a healing, and feel blessed without understanding Isis's mythology or following Egyptian ritual. It was immediate, emotional, and undeniable to the senses. Christianity, with its emphasis on moral instruction and abstract promises, seemed distant in comparison. Faith in a distant God, salvation in the next life, judgment deferred until the end of time, all of it felt intangible beside a visible, moving, music-filled miracle in the market. Romans shared stories after the festivals, exaggerating the feats they had seen. Word spread faster than any bishop could counter with letters or sermons. Traders and sailors returning from Alexandria brought news of miracles that rivaled those in Rome, adding a foreign mystique that made local shrines feel alive with global power. The church eventually learned that spectacle could not be ignored. To compete, they adopted processions of their own, painted icons, and relics paraded through streets. But in the early centuries, Egyptian shrines offered a direct, joyful experience of divinity that Christianity had to fight for centuries to match. The magic was not in demons or curses, but in wonder, in sight and sound, in community and devotion, and that made it far more powerful and far harder to erase. In ancient Egypt, the river was more than water. The Nile was life itself, flooding predictably, nourishing fields, and sustaining cities. But it was also sacred, a divine force. Egyptians believed that to immerse oneself in its waters was to connect with the gods, to be cleansed, renewed, and ready to live in harmony with Ma'at, the principle of order. Priests guided purification rituals that involved bathing, reciting prayers, and anointing with oils. Crowds would gather along the riverbanks to witness ceremonies where the faithful emerged, dripping water, their sins believed washed away, their bodies and spirits aligned with the cosmic order. The parallels with early Christian rites were striking. Christians baptized in the Jordan River or local streams, immersing converts in water to cleanse sin and prepare them for new life in Christ. The symbolism was nearly identical. Both practices promised rebirth, both involved ritual immersion, and both were public acts that transformed an individual spiritually and socially. Observant Egyptians and early Christians alike could see in the other a reflection of their own sacred acts. Meals were also sacred. Egyptians celebrated offerings to Osiris and other gods with feasts in temples. Bread, wine, and meat were blessed, sometimes consumed by priests and worshippers alike. The act was a shared divine moment, a miniature resurrection in the here and now. Christians would later adopt the Eucharist, consuming bread and wine as the body and blood of Christ. To someone living in the first centuries of the Common Era, the gestures of one faith could feel familiar to another. Stories of resurrection added another layer of overlap. Osiris, killed by Seth, dismembered and reassembled, became the ruler of the underworld. His death and rebirth symbolized the eternal cycle of life and afterlife. Jesus, crucified and risen, promised eternal life through his resurrection. The thematic echoes were undeniable. Egyptians, who heard Christian stories, could see an uncanny resonance with their own mythology. Christians could not simply dismiss these connections because they were woven into the fabric of culture, visible in art, in literature, and in ritual. This near mirroring of sacred acts created anxiety among church leaders. To them, the Egyptian cults were not distant pagan curiosities. They were potential competitors, seductive paths that could absorb converts by offering familiarity and emotional immediacy. A worshipper already attuned to the rhythm of the Nile might hesitate to embrace a faith that asked them to unlearn everything while offering similar rewards in a different guise. The church responded cautiously. Sermons warned against returning to pagan practices while adapting some familiar forms to Christian purposes. Baptism became a public spectacle. Holy water was used in homes, and the Eucharist was emphasized as the ultimate act of communion. Yet the threat remained. For centuries, Egyptian rituals lingered in the collective imagination, their echoes faint but persistent, a reminder that salvation was not a monopoly, and that even a new faith could almost be swallowed by an older, deeply rooted devotion. The Nile had baptized generations before the Jordan, and that memory could not easily be erased. Every Christian rite carried the shadow of the river, the echo of resurrection myths, and the unspoken acknowledgement that in some ways the old gods had almost won. In the early centuries of the Common Era, the Church faced a dilemma. How do you fight an enemy that wears 1,000 faces, adapts to every city, and charms every class? The answer came in the form of Satan, a single, recognizable foe, a figure of temptation and malevolence. The bishops could paint him in sermons, depict him in frescoes, and rally believers against him. He was easy to explain, easy to fear, and easy to fight. Everyone knew who he was, everyone knew what he represented, and he never required compromise or negotiation. Egyptian gods, on the other hand, were maddeningly complicated. Isis could be tender and terrifying. Osiris could die and return. Serapis could be a healer or a judge. The cults were not rigidly bound to doctrine. They evolved with each generation, absorbing local gods, blending with Greek deities, adjusting rituals to suit the audience. To a bishop in Rome, this adaptability was alarming. You could not reduce these gods to black and white morality. They were beloved by citizens, merchants, soldiers, and nobles alike. To call them evil outright risked ridicule, or worse, irrelevance. The Egyptian cults also offered something Christianity struggled to match in the early days: immediate, tangible benefits. Festivals, healings, oracles, and public spectacles created joy, community, and hope. People did not merely believe, they experienced. The gods were not abstract. They intervened in daily life. The church could warn of Satan, but how do you warn against miracles that make your arm ache less, your crops grow, or your loved ones recover from illness? The psychological and social pull of Egyptian devotion was hard to counter. Satan was simple to vilify. He was the outsider, the tempter, the embodiment of all that Christians were told to avoid. You could paint him as a horned figure, give him a red tail, and everyone immediately understood Egyptian gods were already woven into homes, temples, marketplaces, and imaginations. They could not be reduced to a caricature. If the church demonized them too aggressively, it risked alienating ordinary people who saw them as protectors, helpers, and providers of hope. This is why sermons of the time often emphasized moral battles against temptation rather than idolatry. Satan could be a stand-in for any evil influence, making him versatile for moral instruction. Meanwhile, the old gods had to be carefully edged out, absorbed, or replaced. Statues were removed or relocated, temples rebranded, and rituals reinterpreted. Christians borrowed what they could. Festivals became saints' feast days, processions became Christian pilgrimages, sacred meals were recast as the Eucharist. The church learned that you could not destroy what people loved, but you could redirect it. In this way, Satan was useful. He gave a face to evil. Egyptian gods were dangerous because they had no single face. Their threat was fluid, persistent, and intimate. They were woven into the hearts of people and the rhythm of their lives. By framing the spiritual war around one enemy, the bishops could rally the faithful while quietly dismantling the influence of gods whose power could not be so easily caricatured. The church learned that the enemy you can name is far easier to control than the one who adapts while you sleep. In the city of Alexandria during the 4th century, the air was thick with debate, devotion, and danger. The great library of Alexandria may have long since fallen, but the city's reputation as a center of wisdom endured. Scrolls, codices, and secret teachings from across the Mediterranean and beyond still found their way into the hands of scholars, philosophers, and the faithful. Egyptian knowledge, layered with Greek philosophy and mystical traditions, was irresistible. It promised insight into life, death, and the cosmos, and that promise made it a target as much as a treasure. Cyril, the Patriarch of Alexandria in the early 500s, understood the stakes. The city's Christians were restless, drawn as much to the old gods as to the new faith. The Serapeum, a grand temple devoted to Serapis, had stood as a symbol of Egyptian power, culture, and spiritual sophistication. When it was destroyed, the flames consumed stone and scroll alike, yet the ideas persisted. Monks, philosophers, and teachers quietly carried fragments of knowledge into monasteries and private collections. The church could burn temples, yet it could not burn curiosity. The prestige of Egyptian wisdom kept smouldering beneath Christian rule, sometimes disguised as philosophy, sometimes folded into scripture commentary. Books that survived the initial wave of destruction became dangerous objects. They contained knowledge that challenged authority and offered alternatives to priestly mediation. Texts on astrology, alchemy, magic, and the human soul's journey threatened to compete with sermons and sacraments. The church realized that controlling the people's mind was as important as controlling their souls. Scholars like Ammonius Saccas had already blended Platonic thought with Egyptian mysticism, producing the seeds of Hermeticism. These seeds could sprout anywhere, in the mind of a curious monk or a young noble, far from the watchful eye of bishops. Philosophers and monks debated openly in Alexandria's streets and lecture halls. Christian apologists condemned pagan rituals, yet the citizens whispered about healings at Egyptian shrines, about secret rites that promised understanding beyond prayer. Even within monasteries, the tension was palpable. Some monks hoarded scrolls they could not openly study. They copied passages in secrecy, hiding knowledge under loose stones or within candle wax seals. Ideas that could not be burned lived on in memory, in ritual, and in coded texts. The destruction of the Serapeum did not end Alexandria's fascination with Egyptian thought. Instead, it transformed it. Knowledge moved underground, migrated to the libraries of monasteries, and crossed borders disguised as commentary on scripture or philosophy. The church had to adapt. Bishops encouraged the veneration of saints and relics, the celebration of Christian festivals, and the framing of morality tales as substitutes for the teachings of Isis and Osiris. They could not erase the memory of the gods, so they sought to overwrite it, to make Christian wisdom the dominant story, without openly acknowledging the depth of what had been lost. Alexandria became a city of memory and control, of visible faith and hidden knowledge. The prestige of Egyptian wisdom smouldered because ideas are not bound to brick and fire. They live in minds, in habits, and in the desire to understand. The church understood that you can burn temples, but you cannot burn curiosity, and so it turned its efforts to shaping perception, while the real knowledge waited quietly, waiting for eyes bold enough to seek it. By the early 4th century, the Roman Empire was changing faster than anyone could keep up with. Constantine had taken power, and with his conversion to Christianity, the balance of spiritual authority began to shift. Temples that had once been the center of civic and spiritual life were now under threat. Edicts were issued across the empire, declaring that pagan worship was no longer acceptable. Statues were toppled, shrines shuttered, and priests dismissed. In cities from Alexandria to Antioch, once bustling temples went dark, their altars abandoned. And yet, the church quickly discovered that laws alone could not erase belief. Bishops preached from pulpits, warning of the dangers of Isis and Serapis, of the old rituals that promised safety, wealth, or healing. These warnings were not necessary for Satan, the symbolic enemy of Christians, but for gods whose cults still thrived in memory and in hidden corners. In the marketplaces, in private homes, in the secret gatherings of wealthy Romans, the rites continued quietly. The Nile's magic still had a grip on imaginations, and bishops knew it. Theodosius, decades later, took things further. Paganism was now illegal, and the penalties were severe. Yet bishops still found themselves addressing congregations about the subtle allure of Egyptian gods. They reminded the faithful that Isis offered comfort as a mother and protector, that Serapis promised cosmic authority, and that to follow them was to risk spiritual ruin. Their persistence was proof of lingering influence, a signal that Egyptian religion had not disappeared. The church needed edicts, sermons, and ritual reinforcement just to keep it in check. Even in private life, people continued to honor these deities. Amulets bearing the image of Isis were still worn. Inscriptions to Osiris were quietly maintained, and the stories of miracle-working gods circulated among families. Christian leaders were anxious, recognizing that converts might drift back toward the old ways if the church did not provide enough spectacle, emotional connection, and ritual. The more the church suppressed Egyptian worship, the more inventive its adherents became, finding ways to blend old rites with Christian practice, keeping memory alive while appearing compliant. This tension between law and lived experience marked a critical moment in history. Rome could enforce obedience publicly, but belief was not so easily legislated. It had to be competed with, replaced, and often reinterpreted. Bishops preached as much to assert authority as to save souls, crafting moral lessons that mirrored the promises of Isis and Serapis, while emphasizing obedience to the Christian God. Each sermon was a battle, a subtle effort to reclaim influence over hearts that still whispered in favor of the old ways. The edicts of Constantine and Theodosius were more than political maneuvers. They revealed a deep anxiety within the church, an awareness that Egyptian gods remained seductive, potent, and culturally embedded. The survival of their memory threatened to dilute Christian authority. proving that power in Rome was not measured solely in laws or decrees. Belief was resilient, and even after temples fell silent, the Church had to fight a quiet war, shaping perception, framing morality, and ensuring that the old gods could not outshine the new faith. Edicts closed doors, but influence lingered, whispering in the minds of Romans, reminding bishops that controlling law was easier than controlling imagination. The shadow of Egypt remained, and Rome's Christian rulers would spend centuries chasing it. Saints began to inherit the spaces once dominated by Egyptian gods, a quiet conquest that reshaped Rome without a single battle. Temples that had echoed with chants to Isis and Serapis slowly hosted the worship of Christian figures. Statues were replaced, but the rituals, the music, the spectacle remained. The Church understood that people did not abandon tradition easily, so it absorbed it, transforming festival and ceremony into a new language of faith. Processions once meant to honor Nile deities were now Marian parades, carrying candles, banners, and sacred music through streets that had known centuries of devotion. Feast days took the place of old celebrations. The timing, the color, even the flavor of certain offerings mirrored those of Egyptian holidays. This was not accidental. Bishops and priests carefully orchestrated each element to feel familiar, to make conversion feel less like loss and more like transformation. The mournful songs of Isis became hymns to Mary, the protective gestures of the old gods transferred to saints who watched over sailors, mothers, and the sick. The faithful could still participate in drama, devotion, and community while acknowledging a new authority. Christianity became a master of choreography. Every ritual, from processions to communal meals, mimicked the rhythm of older traditions while subtly redirecting devotion toward the new pantheon. Nile water became holy water, sacred boats were repurposed for Marian festivals, and healing rites that once belonged to Egyptian shrines were reframed as miracles performed in Christ's name. It was not enough to destroy idols. The Church needed the soul of the ritual, its emotional power, to anchor faith. Church leaders encouraged artisans to adapt iconography as well. Temples were redecorated with mosaics, frescoes, and carvings that referenced biblical stories, but retained the visual cues that resonated with worshippers. Figures of Isis and Osiris disappeared from walls, but their poses, their gestures, and even their symbolism were subtly encoded into images of saints. People attending Mass felt the continuity, a comforting bridge between old devotion and new doctrine. The strategy extended to local festivals. Market days, once tied to Egyptian gods, became feast days for saints, complete with music, food, and pageantry. Children learned prayers that echoed the cadence of old hymns. Families observed rituals with a mix of reverence and nostalgia, never fully aware that the Church had preserved the structure of belief while replacing its content. In absorbing the old pantheon, Christianity did not merely conquer, it translated. By the end of the 5th century, the success of rebranding was clear. Egyptian gods were largely absent from public worship, but their legacy lived on in rhythm, ritual, and memory. Christianity had claimed the spaces of the old world and made them its own. What remained were saints performing the roles of deities, festivals celebrating miracles instead of Nile blessings, and processions that preserved the choreography of a past civilization while proclaiming a new faith. This subtle assimilation revealed the Church's greatest strength. It did not fight only with fire and sword, it fought with rhythm, music, and human experience, transforming devotion from within. By making the familiar sacred in a new way, the Church ensured that the old god's influence did not vanish, but quietly became the foundation for Christian triumph. Mary's image did not appear overnight fully formed. It evolved slowly, shaped by the Church to compete with a goddess whose devotees had centuries of devotion behind them. Isis had been everywhere, in shrines, in homes, in hearts. She was the mother, the mourner, the protector, the miracle worker. To win followers, Mary had to become all of those things too, and the Church understood that the language of images mattered as much as words. Thrones, stars, crowns, and the nursing child became tools in this quiet war. When Mary was depicted seated on a throne, it was no accident. The pose echoed the familiar image of Isis enthroned, regal and serene. Worshippers approached the altar with a sense of continuity, their eyes recognizing power and compassion in a new face. The haloed crown above Mary's head became a starry echo of Isis's celestial symbolism. It connected heaven and earth, miracle and daily life, promising divine protection in ways people already understood. Art became the battlefield, and the faithful were the audience. Mary nursing the child was the most delicate maneuver of all. Mothers in Rome and Alexandria saw in Isis a nurturer, a bridge between mortal worry and divine reassurance. By depicting Mary holding Jesus in the same tender, human way, the Church redirected affection, prayers, and devotion from one figure to another. Every brushstroke whispered a message: you can trust Mary the same way you trusted Isis, only now the story aligns with the new faith. The Church did not destroy emotion, it borrowed it. Iconography extended beyond painting. Statuary, mosaics, and tapestries all participated in the subtle redirection of worship. Every fold of a robe, the tilt of a head, the gesture of an outstretched hand carried meaning. Isis's mourning pose became Mary's sorrow at the crucifixion. Isis's protective gaze became Mary watching over pilgrims, sailors, mothers, and children. The shift was invisible at first, but powerful, a soft conquest that required no armies. Even rituals reinforced the imagery. Feasts once honouring Isis were timed to coincide with Marian celebrations. Processions followed familiar paths, carried familiar symbols, but ended at a new altar. Music and incense remained, creating sensory bridges from old devotion to new. Pilgrims felt continuity without confusion, loyalty without resistance, devotion without contradiction. The Church had discovered that images, carefully calibrated, could shape hearts as effectively as doctrine. By the 6th century, Mary's image had become central to Christian life across the Mediterranean. Isis was no longer the public face of devotion, but she had not disappeared entirely. Her influence lived on quietly in the iconography of saints, the rhythm of festivals, and the subconscious memory of worshippers. The Velvet War was won not by conflict, but by substitution, by gentle persuasion through colour, posture, and symbol. The Church's strategy revealed a deep understanding of human psychology. Faith was not only belief, it was visual, emotional, and habitual. By clothing Mary in the language of Isis, Christianity claimed hearts without admitting defeat, proving that victory need not be violent to be complete. Devotion was redirected, preserved, and transformed, securing Mary's place at the centre of a world once enthralled by Egyptian gods. Early Christian writers could not ignore the gods of Egypt. They claimed Isis, Osiris, and Serapis were no longer divine, that they had fallen, corrupted, or been cast down. They called them demons, fallen angels, spirits of deception. But their obsession betrayed something deeper. The energy with which patristic writers argued against these gods suggested they were fighting a rival that would not die quietly. Every sermon warning against the power of Isis or the wisdom of Hermes hinted at lingering influence, a devotion that remained stubbornly alive among the people. The letters of Augustine, for example, describe crowds flocking to altars where incense filled the air, chanting echoed in courtyards, and priests performed acts of healing and divination. He called them sorceries, tricks of Satan, but the detail he provided in describing ceremonies suggested fascination as much as fear. If these gods were dead, why describe them so vividly? Why catalogue the miracles, the festivals, the rites? Their persistence mattered, and the Church's writings reflect the anxiety that a living, breathing tradition could not be crushed by decree alone. Cyril of Alexandria confronted the Serapeum not merely with a theological argument, but with an act of violent intervention. Yet his letters show he felt the spiritual pulse of Egypt would not be extinguished. Serapis, fused from Osiris and Apis with a Hellenistic face, became the ultimate test for Christian authority. To call him a demon was easy. To explain why citizens continued to seek his blessing was far harder. Their persistence was a challenge to bishops and emperors alike, a reminder that faith cannot be killed with words alone. Even when patristic texts labelled Hermes Trismegistus and his writings as dangerous and heretical, they studied his philosophy, referenced his ideas, and argued obsessively against them. Personal gnosis, the pursuit of hidden knowledge, was tempting. It bypassed clergy, disregarded sacraments, and promised direct connection with the divine. Every warning about fallen angels doubled as a map of where power still lingered. Scholars and preachers alike could not afford to ignore the threat. The concept of fallen angels was useful rhetorically, but it also disguised respect. Egyptian gods carried authority and charisma. Their temples attracted pilgrims from far beyond Alexandria or Thebes. Bishops preached that Osiris was a demon, yet they marveled at the organized ceremonies, the music, the spectacle that kept crowds loyal. To demonize a rival is one thing, to obsess over them is another. Here lies proof that these gods were never fully dead. Patristic literature becomes a window into a hidden struggle. Every condemnation, every allegory, every polemic against Egypt was not only a theological argument, but also an admission that the old ways retained vitality. The Church had not conquered minds, it had redirected them, fought them with narrative, and appropriated symbols where possible. Calling Isis and Serapis fallen angels was not just warning, it was recognition. They were competitors, they were alive. By the 5th century, Egypt's temples were closed, but the sermons continued, the warnings persisted, the fear lingered. If the gods were truly gone, why continue to speak of them as forces that could corrupt or enchant? The answer lies in the same place as every great rivalry, the living devotion of the people. The Egyptian gods were demons in the official story, but in practice they were something more. They were reminders that power and faith could not be legislated, only carefully managed. The deserts of Egypt were not empty spaces. They were crucibles of spiritual experiment, where monks and hermits carved lives of ascetic discipline out of sand, stone, and Sunday. They fasted for days, sometimes weeks, pushing the body and mind to edges, where visions became reality and prayer became action. These monks inherited techniques older than Christianity, wisdom born from centuries of Egyptian mystics who had walked the same sands, seen the same stars, and sought the same divine connection. Fasting, purification, and ritualized meditation were not new inventions. They were technologies of the soul passed down, adapted, and Christianized to fight invisible enemies. Monks recorded battles with spirits, demons, and shadowy presences that haunted the desert. These were not casual ghost stories. They were structured engagements with powers that the monks understood, named, and sometimes negotiated with. The techniques often mirrored Egyptian practices. Protective amulets, symbolic gestures, prayers repeated with precise cadence, and visualization exercises all had parallels in pre-Christian wisdom. Monastic authors sometimes claimed their power came directly from God, but the echoes of Isis, Osiris, and Hermes Trismegistus lingered in every formula, whether they admitted it or not. The monastic cell became a laboratory. Here, the body was tested, the spirit disciplined, and the mind trained. Visionary experiences were catalogued, debated, and interpreted as signs of divine favor or the presence of evil. The desert itself was a teacher. Wind, sun, and sand imposed harsh conditions that forged resilience and awareness. Christian monks rebranded these experiences as battles for the soul, yet the framework had unmistakable continuity with Egyptian magic and ritual. The Church often overlooked this continuity, emphasizing the outward Christian label while ignoring the deeper spiritual inheritance. Hermits walked for miles to isolated caves and cliffs, leaving behind towns, families, and worldly comfort. Their devotion attracted disciples, creating networks of knowledge that spread quickly across Egypt and into the wider Mediterranean. Fasts were not just acts of obedience, they were tools to sharpen perception, open doors to visions, and engage in what they called warfare with spirits. Every ritual, every prayer, every symbolic gesture was a rehearsal for cosmic combat, a lesson learned in secrecy, refined over generations. These monks also became intermediaries for ordinary people who sought healing, counsel, or insight. The monastic techniques of the desert offered power that rivaled any temple miracle. People came to see them as channels of divine authority. They could bless water, cast out evil, or interpret dreams. Their practices were subtle, hidden, but immensely effective. The church sometimes feared their influence because it drew devotion away from public liturgy into private, intense, and deeply personal experiences. By the 4th and 5th centuries, the desert monks had transformed the landscape of Christian spirituality. They took older Egyptian spiritual technology and gave it new names, new saints, new texts. Fasts, visions, and spiritual warfare survived because they worked. They were inherited, not invented. To the casual observer, these monks were saints and hermits. To those who looked closer, they were custodians of an ancient current of power that the church had tried to contain but could not erase. Their lives proved that Egyptian wisdom never truly died. It simply learned to wear a Christian robe. Walk through any old European cathedral, and you might think you are seeing purely Christian symbols. The stained glass, the pointed arches, the soaring ceilings all scream devotion. But look closer. Trace the sun motifs on capitals, the serpentine carvings curling around columns, the obelisks flanking altars, and you will start to see another story. Symbols that once belonged to Egypt, to the sun gods, to the protective serpents called uraei, did not vanish when Rome adopted Christianity. They survived quietly, tucked into the margins of sacred architecture and city design, waiting for eyes that could read them. The solar disk was everywhere. Once it crowned the heads of Ra and Horus, representing divine power, eternal life, and cosmic order. Now it appeared as a halo, a sunburst behind the Virgin, or a circular window high above a nave. To the untrained eye, it was decoration. To those who remembered, it was a message that light, life, and divine authority were still coded into the walls. Uraei, the sacred snakes guarding tombs and temples, slithered into carved mouldings, stair rails, and floor mosaics. They were no longer protectors of pharaohs, but silent guardians of memory, an encoded lineage of protection and power that Christianity had absorbed without acknowledgement. Ankhs, the Egyptian sign of life, were redrawn into crosses, subtly reminding initiates that life, death, and resurrection were part of a larger, older cycle. Obelisks, once markers of solar worship, were transported to Roman squares, Christian plazas, and church courtyards. Their verticality drew the eye to heaven, their inscriptions stripped but their form retained, a muted conversation between old and new. Every city square, every chapel, every cloister held echoes of a spiritual architecture that predated Christian theology by thousands of years. City planning itself was influenced. Streets laid out in axial lines, plazas aligned with sunrise on solstices, and churches positioned according to solar and stellar alignments were not accidental. The architects, whether conscious or inherited through tradition, carried forward a design language from temples of Isis, Horus, and Ra. The city became a living manuscript, each obelisk, each fountain, each basilica, a letter in a coded story of continuity. Even Christian festivals carried shadows of Egyptian reverence. Feasts of saints, solar alignments, and processions along riverbanks echoed ancient rituals, celebrating life, death, and cosmic balance. The meanings had shifted, but the forms persisted. Worshippers might never recognize the ancestry of the symbols they passed daily, yet the energy of the originals lingered, shaping devotion, perception, and awe. By the 7th century, the Church had learned a delicate art. Egyptian symbols could not be destroyed entirely. They were too compelling, too familiar, too powerful in the collective imagination. Instead, their meanings were muted, transformed, and woven into the new narrative. The sun still rose over the cathedrals, the snake still curled around sacred thresholds, and the obelisks still pierced the sky. The afterlife of these symbols was not in temples or tombs, but in the architecture and urban landscapes of a world that had once trembled before the gods of Egypt and had learned to live with them quietly hidden in plain sight. Imagine a monastery in the heart of Rome in the year 450. Candles flickering against the walls, the scent of parchment and ink heavy in the air. Monks sit in silence, copying texts with precision, their quills scratching in rhythm with the chanting drifting from the chapel. Some of the books they copy are not pious meditations or lives of saints, but hermetic texts from Egypt, manuscripts promising hidden knowledge, secrets of the mind and cosmos, ways to see the universe as a living, conscious entity. The irony is thick because the same bishops who condemn these writings from the pulpit are the ones quietly commissioning copies for their own studies. They speak of heresy in public, yet in private they hunger for insight. The Hermetica offered personal gnosis, a kind of understanding that did not require a priest or sacrament. It promised visions, dialogues with gods, and cosmic wisdom, but framed in a language older than Christianity, older than Rome itself. To many, it was dangerous, a rival path that could pull souls away from the church. And yet, monks preserved it, hiding it on high shelves, in locked chests, or under layers of unremarkable texts. When bishops visited, they often ignored these hidden books, their presence tolerated because knowledge, after all, was power. The church could not afford to be ignorant, even as it publicly condemned the work. Scribes were both archivists and secret guardians. They copied lines, illustrations, and diagrams with extreme care, often using coded symbols to mask the meaning from casual readers. Margins were filled with notes in shorthand, hints for those who knew the code, silent conversations across generations of monks. A single manuscript could carry layers of commentary, blending Christian interpretation with Hermetic thought, a fusion of worlds that should have been enemies. To read these books without guidance was dangerous, but in the right hands, they offered an unparalleled lens into the human spirit and the natural world. Libraries became places of tension. On the surface, shelves of psalters and canonical works proclaimed orthodoxy. Beneath, manuscripts from Alexandria, from the Nile, from Hellenistic Egypt whispered a different story. Saints like Augustine and Jerome often referenced such works cautiously, sometimes warning against them, sometimes borrowing from them in subtle ways. The Church could not entirely destroy this knowledge because it was woven into the intellectual fabric of Europe. To erase it entirely would be to sever a connection to science, philosophy, and mysticism that predated Christianity and still had utility. By the 9th century, monasteries across France, Spain, and Italy were quietly harbouring these texts. Some would circulate under new names, disguised as Christian commentaries or philosophical treatises. Others remained untouched, waiting for curious eyes, waiting for someone brave enough to read, to learn, to synthesize. In every candlelit scriptorium, there was a tension between fear and fascination, heresy and authority, control and curiosity. The Hermetica survived not because the Church embraced it, but because it could not fully destroy the allure of the knowledge it contained, a secret that flowed quietly beneath the surface, shaping minds and guiding visionaries, invisible yet unbroken. In the year 600, a small village in Gaul hummed with the sounds of daily life, but beneath the rhythm of bread baking and sheep tending, there was another kind of practice, a quiet blend of magic and medicine. Parish priests walked the cobbled streets carrying prayer books and holy water, warning villagers about Egyptian arts, charms, and incantations that might call down demons. Yet, behind closed doors, many of these same priests were adapting those same practices into their pastoral care. Amulets became medals, blessed with the sign of the cross. Spells became prayers of deliverance, words carefully chosen to heal both body and spirit. The line between heresy and helpful ritual was thinner than the parchment in their manuscripts. The villagers themselves did not always know the difference. When a child fell ill, mothers and fathers brought herbs, talismans, and whispered chants to the church, hoping the priest could turn the ancient wisdom into something acceptable to God. Incantations to Thoth or Isis were recited as prayers to saints. Oils, once part of Egyptian healing rites, were mixed with holy water. A simple touch or blessing could cure fever, calm pain, or soothe anxiety. The church was learning to harness these practices without admitting their origin, transforming the magic of Egypt into medicine sanctioned by God. This blending was practical, not accidental. Parish priests were the front line of Christian influence. They could not simply scold villagers for turning to traditional remedies without offering something better or at least equivalent. So they studied amulets for their protective qualities, herbs for their curative effects, and charms for their psychological power. Manuals written for priests across Europe contained sections warning against reliance on pagan magic, yet provided instructions for ritualized cures. A charm against the evil eye became a protective medal. A spell for safe childbirth became a prayer invoking St. Mary. Knowledge was preserved under the guise of orthodoxy. The Church's adaptation of Egyptian arts also reflected its understanding of human nature. People craved tangible acts, visible symbols that reassured them in an uncertain world. Prayer could be abstract, but a medal hung around the neck, a touch from a priest, a whispered blessing, they were concrete and immediate. The effectiveness of these adapted rituals reinforced the Church's authority while quietly keeping the essence of the older knowledge alive. By the year 800, monasteries had become centres not only of learning, but of applied healing. Physicians trained in classical medicine studied alongside monks copying texts from Alexandria. Remedies and rituals intertwined, creating a system where magic, medicine, and faith were inseparable. In every parish, the echoes of Egyptian arts survived, transformed, and Christianized, yet still potent. The priest became a custodian of both spiritual and practical power, walking the delicate line between condemnation and incorporation. Through this, the Church maintained control, protected its flock, and ensured that even forbidden knowledge could serve its purposes, a quiet testament to the enduring influence of Egypt that Rome could never fully erase. In the 15th century, Florence and Rome buzzed with energy, scholars, artists, and priests all chasing knowledge and beauty. The Renaissance was a time when the world seemed to open up, when old texts were dusted off, translated, and read aloud in candlelit studies. Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola were among the leading minds, turning to the Hermetic writings once buried and feared. They translated Hermes, the messenger of the gods, into Latin, revealing a wisdom that promised understanding of the cosmos, of human nature, and of the divine. Suddenly, the Church found itself in a delicate position. They had spent centuries condemning these texts as dangerous, heretical, but now the same words were being read and studied openly, sometimes even in Vatican libraries. Popes, too, were not immune to fascination. Julius II and Leo X collected obelisks, Egyptian statues, and ancient manuscripts. Rome became a gallery, where the artifacts of a lost religion were displayed proudly, but under the Church's control. The obelisks were not just decoration, they were symbols of knowledge and power, monuments to an older world that the Church had once fought to suppress. By bringing these objects into the Vatican, the papacy subtly claimed mastery over them. The old gods of Egypt had returned, but under the mask of Christianity. Artists incorporated Egyptian motifs into frescoes, altarpieces, and architecture. Sun discs appeared behind saints' heads. Figures posed like Isis or Thoth in biblical narratives. These were not accidents or purely decorative choices. They were a reminder that the wisdom of Egypt could coexist with Christian authority, that the Church could appropriate, translate, and redirect the old knowledge without conceding spiritual ground. The Renaissance made the lines between heresy and orthodoxy blurrier than ever. Humanists were excited by the promise of personal insight. Pico wrote about the potential of humans to rise to divine understanding through study and contemplation, echoing Hermetic philosophy. Ficino emphasized the harmony between the stars, the soul, and God. The Vatican, while cautious, allowed this infusion because it reinforced a vision of power and intellect that could be guided rather than opposed. Scholars learned to speak the language of the ancients, yet they had to frame it within a Christian worldview. By the year 1500, the mask had slipped further than anyone anticipated. Egyptian knowledge, once the enemy, was now a tool. The Church could use the imagery, the texts, and the philosophies to educate, inspire, and consolidate authority. The Hermetic writings no longer threatened the bishops openly, but they reminded everyone that wisdom does not die, and that Rome's fear had been real. The gods of Egypt, long hidden and demonized, now walked openly through the halls of the Vatican, not as rivals, but as silent partners in the Church's claim to universal knowledge and timeless power. In the year 1590, Rome was a city of transformation, filled with the clatter of construction, the murmur of scholars, and the prayers of thousands. Pope Sixtus V had a vision unlike any before him to reshape the city's skyline, to make a statement of faith and power visible from every piazza and street. Among his most striking projects were the obelisks, tall, ancient monoliths brought from Egypt, standing silent witnesses to centuries of desert sun and river life. These stones were older than Rome itself, carved with hieroglyphs telling stories of kings and gods, of the Nile and the sun, yet now they rose under the shadow of St. Peter's Basilica, crowned with crosses. The juxtaposition was deliberate, audacious, and full of meaning. The crosses atop the obelisks were not just symbols of Christian triumph, they were statements of continuity. Egypt had not died. Its monuments, its memory, its presence had been incorporated, domesticated, and redirected. By placing these pagan monoliths in the heart of Christendom, the Vatican acknowledged the weight and endurance of Egyptian civilization, while asserting control over it. The obelisks became markers of power, reminders that the Church could claim mastery over time itself, turning relics of rival belief into instruments of its own authority. Pilgrims and citizens walking the piazzas may have admired the obelisks simply as marvels of engineering or as awe-inspiring decorations, but every carving, every vertical line carried echoes of a world older than the Christian era. The priests and architects knew this. The hieroglyphs, the sun symbols, the kings and gods etched into granite had survived fires, invasions, and centuries of neglect. Now they were under the Church's gaze, still speaking in their own language, yet reshaped to serve a new story. Sixtus V was meticulous. He positioned the obelisks along axes, leading to churches and piazzas, aligning them with streets, fountains, and statues, in ways that created sightlines, processional routes, and visual narratives. As the faithful processed through Rome, they were guided past these symbols, sensing an ancient order harmonized with the Christian city. The obelisks, standing in shadow of street, Peter's dome, became silent teachers of continuity, of assimilation, and of a civilization repurposed rather than erased. By the dawn of the 17th century, the obelisks had become icons not of pagan resistance, but of Christian ingenuity. Scholars debated, travelers wondered, and the hieroglyphs whispered their secrets to anyone willing to look closely. Egypt was present in Rome, but it had been transformed, its power folded into the church's narrative. The obelisks, once monuments to kings and gods, now carried crosses at their peaks, bridging millennia of culture, belief, and human ambition. In Sixtus V's vision, the message was clear. Rome had conquered Egypt not through erasure, but through absorption, turning the old god's stone into a statement of eternal continuity. By the year 1580, the Jesuits had become the church's sharpest instruments, trained not only in theology, but in rhetoric, science, and strategy. Their missions stretched from the ports of Lisbon to the forests of South America, the islands of Asia, and the deserts of Africa. Everywhere they went, the template they carried was unmistakable. Identify older gods, understand them, and redirect devotion toward Christianity. The lessons honed in Alexandria, Rome, and the shadow of Egyptian temples now travelled across oceans, shaping encounters with cultures whose pantheons rivaled anything the Mediterranean had ever known. Jesuit letters from 1593 describe towns where incense hung thick, where processions rivaled any feast in Europe, and where priests of local gods healed, taught, and inspired as effectively as any bishop. The missionaries, trained to recognize the patterns of Egyptian cults, knew exactly how to respond. They labeled idols as false, spirits as fallen, yet quietly adapted rituals that resonated with the people. Music, dance, and festival timing were kept. Sacred meals became Eucharist-like experiences. Protective charms were baptized and blessed. The church's goal was not annihilation, but absorption. In Japan, during the early 1600s, Jesuits marveled at Shinto shrines, the elaborate ceremonies of kami worship, and the dedication of local priests. Rather than destroying temples, they built churches alongside them, learning which festivals coincided with Christian feast days. In the Americas, Aztec and Inca rituals were studied with similar precision. The missionaries recorded every detail: solar calendars, sacred geometry, offerings, and chants. Knowledge that would have been condemned in Europe as Egyptian arts was now a guidebook for conversion. The fear that had driven Rome against Isis, Osiris, and Serapis fueled these missions. Jesuits worried that local gods could absorb the faithful, creating parallel systems that threatened papal authority. Every ritual left unchecked was a potential rival, a living echo of power outside the church. Yet fear was paired with pragmatism. The Jesuits understood that devotion could not be snuffed out by decree alone. It had to be redirected, channeled, and gradually transformed. Letters from 1598 reveal success and tension. In Goa, festivals once dedicated to Hindu deities now incorporated Christian symbolism. In Mexico, Aztec processions were replaced with Marian feasts, yet the music, colours, and timing remained. Everywhere the Jesuits went, the pattern repeated. Identify the living power, name it, then carefully bend it to serve a new story. The old gods were never truly destroyed. They were muted, remade, and folded into Christian worlds. By the end of the 16th century, the Jesuit template was clear. Rome's ancient strategy against Egypt was no longer local or symbolic. It had become global, a method of understanding, fearing, and ultimately converting the divine legacies of entire continents. The old gods lived on, but beneath crosses and altars, their presence reinterpreted, their power absorbed, and the church's reach expanded beyond borders, oceans, and time itself. In the year 1811, Europe buzzed with fascination, as Napoleon Bonaparte's scholars returned from Egypt with hundreds of sketches, maps, and descriptions, soon compiled into the monumental Description de l'Egypte. Cities, monuments, temples, and hieroglyphs unfolded in massive volumes. Printed for the first time and sent to libraries, salons, and curious nobles across the continent. Ancient knowledge, once hidden beneath sand and shadow, suddenly became fashionable, exciting minds in Paris, Vienna, and London. The pyramids, obelisks, and sphinxes inspired awe, art, and even jewellery. Designers and architects incorporated Egyptian motifs into palaces and churches, and Masons used the imagery in lodges and secret societies, the same imagery that had once threatened Rome in Alexandria. The Vatican watched all of this unfold with measured anxiety. Popes and cardinals could not ignore the fascination with Isis, Osiris, and the pharaohs. The Church had survived centuries of Egyptian influence by redirecting worship and absorbing symbols, yet now Egyptian culture had become a trend, not a faith, and that posed a subtle danger. European elites admired the old gods, the obelisks, and the ritual architecture without mediation. The imagery carried power and resonance outside the Church's authority, awakening curiosity about ancient wisdom that papal edicts had long tried to suppress. In Rome, whispers among clerics spoke of the subtle threat. Scholars debated whether to condemn or to quietly study. Some argued that fascination with Egyptian artifacts was harmless, merely aesthetic. Others worried that the fascination could revive dangerous ideas about divine kings, hidden knowledge, or even magic, stirring secular power that might rival papal influence. Yet the Pope spoke little. There was no public condemnation, no formal ban, only silence and careful observation. Napoleon himself, aware of the Church's unease, encouraged the study and display of Egyptian relics, sometimes presenting them as trophies of conquest, sometimes as proof of civilization's endurance. Engineers brought obelisks from Luxor to Paris, churches incorporated lotus and sun motifs, and artists painted scenes of pharaohs, priests, and Nile rituals in vivid oils. Egypt became a stage for curiosity, power, and prestige. Meanwhile, secret societies quietly expanded their Egyptian-inspired rituals, from Masonic lodges to salons where Enlightenment thinkers debated metaphysics and history. The Church could not monitor all of them, nor could it fully control the appeal of a religion older than Rome itself. Egyptian symbols became metaphors, teaching tools, and aesthetic cues. The old gods, though not worshipped openly, persisted in the imagination of Europe, embedded in culture and social life. By 1815, the impact was clear. Europe was caught between fascination and fear. Napoleon had unleashed an Egyptian renaissance, whether intentionally or by accident, and the Vatican, though silent publicly, knew that the images, stories, and symbols now circulating widely carried a kind of living power. They could not be erased. The Church's centuries of controlling Egypt's legacy were being tested, not by armies or decrees, but by ink, paper, and the minds of an entire continent, curious, eager, and unknowingly remembering what Rome had long tried to forget. In the year 1850, Europe was simmering with fascination for things hidden and mystical. Scholars and adventurers pored over Egyptian tombs, manuscripts, and hieroglyphs, while writers like Eliphas Levi began translating ancient wisdom into manuals of magic that captivated a curious public. Crowley, a few decades later, pushed these ideas even further, blending Egyptian imagery with personal gnosis, ritual, and esoteric systems. The old gods, the symbols of Nile and desert, now framed power in a way the Church had never anticipated. Ancient motifs, ankhs, scarabs, sun discs appeared in lodges, books, and even theatrical performances, connecting a modern audience to a spiritual tradition the Vatican had long tried to erase. The Church, already wary from Napoleon's description de l'Egypte, responded cautiously but decisively. Papal encyclicals reminded the faithful that magic, occult practice, and worship of foreign deities were dangerous paths that led away from God. Bishops preached warnings about secret societies, tarot cards, and Egyptian-inspired rituals, recycling the anxieties that had surfaced during the early Christian battles with Isis and Serapis. The language was familiar. These practices were seductive, alluring, and capable of undermining spiritual authority. Yet, even as the Church condemned, it had to acknowledge the persistent human curiosity for hidden knowledge, a curiosity that no decree could fully extinguish. Occult revivalists, however, did not see themselves as rivals to Christianity in the traditional sense. They were explorers of history, of consciousness, and of the divine potential within the individual. Egyptian symbolism became a universal language, one that bridged past and present, magic and philosophy, art and ritual. Scarabs symbolized rebirth, the sun disk represented eternal illumination, and the lotus held the promise of spiritual awakening. These were not merely ornaments or storybook relics. They were a code for power and knowledge, a challenge to authority cloaked in beauty and mystery. In Paris, London, and Berlin, the revival flourished. Scholars debated the interpretation of texts found in tombs, comparing them to Hermetic treatises and medieval grimoires hidden in monastery libraries. Freemasons and other secret societies incorporated Egyptian motifs into rituals and architecture. The Church recognized the danger not only of pagan symbols, but of the ideas they carried. Self-directed spiritual authority, personal gnosis, and a connection to a past older than Rome itself. These were the very things bishops had fought to contain in Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. By 1920, the revival had become international. The occult seeped into popular culture, literature, and art. Egyptian motifs appeared in jewelry, theatre, and the visual vocabulary of avant-garde artists. The Vatican issued additional warnings, emphasizing obedience, prayer, and caution. Yet the pattern was familiar. The Church never destroyed the knowledge completely. It monitored, it guided, and it attempted to redirect curiosity. The old strategy persisted: absorption, rebranding, and the careful containment of something irresistible, something that spoke to the human desire for mystery, power, and connection to a sacred past. The Egyptian gods had returned, not openly, but in whispers, symbols, and the imagination. And the Church responded in ways both familiar and adaptive, carrying forward a struggle that began over 15 centuries earlier. Walk into any cathedral in Europe, and you will notice something strange if you pay attention. The smell of incense curls in the air like it has for centuries. The procession winds through aisles, faithful moving together in a rhythm that echoes older rites. The Easter sunrise service, the carefully arranged relics, even the small boats carrying saintly images through waters during festivals, all of these Christian forms carry the fingerprints of Egypt. From the Nile to Rome, from Isis to Mary, practices were never fully erased, only adapted. The Church had learned early on that direct confrontation rarely worked against what people already loved. It was easier to absorb, to reshape, to claim continuity while quietly changing meaning, and yet the resemblance persisted, and with it, the unease. The use of incense, for instance, is not only symbolic of prayer rising to heaven. In Egyptian temples, it was a bridge between the human and divine. Temples of Isis and Serapis used smoke to carry offerings and intentions to gods whose names were spoken with care. When bishops approved incense in Christian ritual, they were, knowingly or not, tapping into a practice that had mesmerized people for centuries. The smell itself carried authority and awe, something that had once been the province of temples that Christian leaders feared and tried to erase. Processions, too, are strikingly similar. Egyptians paraded sacred images through cities, sometimes on boats, sometimes on wheeled shrines. Citizens followed, sang, and participated in acts of devotion that were both public spectacle and personal meditation. Christianity did the same. Relic boats carrying saints' bones or representations of Christ and Mary echo the Nile processions in choreography and civic participation. Every footstep, every swing of the censer is a quiet tribute to what once was, and a subtle reminder to the Church that the patterns of devotion could not be contained by theology alone. Even the calendar preserves traces. Easter, celebrated in the early morning as the sun rises, resonates with Egyptian solar symbolism. The resurrection becomes aligned with light and renewal, as was the daily rebirth of Ra across the sky. Priests and theologians may frame it in Christian terms, but the instinctual power of aligning worship with cycles of sun and season remains unmistakable. Worshippers feel it, even if they do not recognize its origin. This persistence of resemblance is what keeps church authorities uneasy, even today. The forms survive not because they are subversive, but because they are effective. They communicate, inspire, and organize devotion in ways that humans have always responded to. And because these forms trace back to an era before the church held dominance, there is an implicit reminder that power in faith is not solely doctrinal, but cultural and aesthetic. That Egypt, long defeated on the battlefield of theology, continues to assert influence through rhythm, scent, and spectacle. The fear is subtle but real. The old gods are not here in name, but in practice, and their shadow lingers in every incense-filled nave and sunlit morning of Easter. The liturgy remembers, even when history pretends to forget. Imagine the early Vatican, corridors echoing with the chants of bishops and the clatter of scriptoriums, yet behind every polished mosaic and golden altar, a quiet tension thrummed. The fear was not of Satan. Satan was a concept, a single enemy to name, point at, and rally against. Egypt was different. Egypt was alive in the minds of the people, in the rhythms of daily worship, in the incense, the music, the visual language of devotion. Maternal, magical, and cosmological, it offered a sacred system that already worked. It promised care, protection, and guidance in a way that a nascent church still struggled to achieve. It could not be banished simply with sermons or decrees, and that was terrifying. The maternal power of Isis, the careful rituals of Osiris, the cosmological balance of Ra, they were embodied, tangible, and practiced. Mothers in Alexandria, sailors in Rome, even senators and merchants felt the effect of these rites. The reassurance of divine care through well-loved forms. Christianity could argue, could excommunicate, could destroy temples, but it could not instantly replace the comfort and structure that these Egyptian systems provided. This is why bishops rebranded, why Mary inherited the throne and crown of Isis, why relic boats floated as if on the Nile, and why incense continued to curl in sacred spaces. It was management, not annihilation. Magic and miracle were central. Amulets transformed into medals, spells became prayers, priests adapted cures that once belonged to the old gods. The church feared not only the theological correctness of belief, but its effectiveness. People had experienced divine intervention through Egyptian forms and rituals for centuries. How could the new faith persuade them that its abstractions were more potent than the charms and processions that had actually worked? The fear was existential. If belief could thrive elsewhere, devotion could waver, allegiance could shift, and the church's monopoly on sacred authority could falter. Cosmology, too, was a silent battlefield. The Egyptians aligned worship with the stars, with the cycles of sun and river, with patterns that connected human life to the universe. Christian liturgy borrowed these patterns: Easter at sunrise, saint feast days in cyclical order, the orientation of churches along solar axes. The Vatican's adoption was a concession, a way to domesticate something too powerful to ignore, to channel it into sanctioned forms, to reduce risk while preserving resonance. In this sense, Egyptian gods never died. They were repurposed, absorbed, and quietly managed. Ultimately, the fear behind the cross was the recognition of human attachment. Sacred systems that truly work do not vanish overnight. They live in hearts, in rituals, in the subtle and everyday ways that people seek meaning. Egypt offered a competing system that could not be erased, only directed. The church's genius was in containment, in translation, in absorption. Every cross, Every sermon, every procession, was both a claim of victory and a silent acknowledgement. The old gods still mattered. They were managed, never forgotten, and the Vatican's fear was not of demons, but of devotion that refused to be conquered. Egypt's legacy endures because it worked, and the shadow of that effectiveness shaped every decision, every ritual, and every sacred step that followed.